Picture two coworkers, same company, same starting salary of $72,000, same age, 29, standing in the same parking lot after their first week at the same job. Both decide independently to prioritize saving aggressively toward early retirement. Both read the same books, follow the same online communities, run the same spreadsheets. The first one buys a home at 31, a modest 3-bedroom in a decent suburb, putting $45,000 down, taking on a 30-year mortgage, and feeling, correctly by most conventional wisdom, like a responsible adult who's finally building real wealth instead of throwing money away on rent. The second one keeps renting a 1-bedroom apartment, takes that same $45,000 and every dollar that would have gone toward a down payment or a mortgage principal payment over the following decade, and instead invests it directly into a diversified portfolio of index funds month after month without exception. At 46, the homeowner has a house worth roughly $520,000, a remaining mortgage balance of around $310,000, meaning roughly $210,000 in home equity, alongside a modest retirement account that's grown slower than planned because so much of their monthly cash flow for 15 years went toward mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, and the steady drip of home maintenance and unexpected repairs. Their net worth on paper looks respectable. Their actual retirement readiness, measured by liquid, accessible assets that could fund monthly living expenses, tells a very different story. The renter, at the same age, 46, has a liquid investment portfolio worth roughly $890,000, built from the same starting capital, the same monthly savings capacity, redirected entirely into markets instead of split between a mortgage and a portfolio. They're still renting. They don't have an asset in the traditional sense that shows up as a single large number on a net worth statement labeled home. What they have is optionality, the ability to actually stop working right now and fund a comfortable early retirement from assets they can sell, in whole or in part, whenever they choose, without needing to sell a house, relocate, or take on a reverse mortgage to access the wealth they've built. This isn't a story about renting being morally superior to owning, and it isn't a story about home ownership being a mistake. It's a story about a specific, very common blind spot in how people pursuing early retirement think about their home. They treat it as an asset supporting their goal, when for the specific objective of retiring early, it frequently functions as one of the largest silent obstacles to that exact goal. Precisely because nobody ever explains the mechanism clearly enough for most people to notice it happening in their own financial life. I'm going to walk you through exactly how home ownership can quietly sabotage an early retirement strategy specifically, even while it remains a perfectly reasonable decision for other goals. Break down the specific mechanisms through which this happens. Take apart the myths that keep this blind spot invisible. Look at real examples of how this plays out, and give you a clear framework for deciding, based on your actual goal, whether buying makes sense for you or whether it's quietly working against the exact outcome you're trying to build. Here's the mechanism nobody explains clearly when people are deciding whether to buy a home. Early retirement isn't primarily about net worth. It's about liquid, income-producing, or reliably drawable assets that can fund monthly expenses without requiring you to keep working. A home doesn't produce income unless you rent it out, and it can't be partially liquidated to cover this month's grocery bill the way a brokerage account can. It's an illiquid asset that happens to appreciate, sometimes substantially, but appreciation you can't easily access without selling the entire thing, taking on debt against it, or moving somewhere cheaper. 3 options that each come with their own significant costs and complications, precisely at the moment you're trying to actually execute an early retirement. This distinction between net worth and liquid, retirement fundable assets is the single most important concept in this entire video, because almost every mechanism that follows traces back to this same root cause. A dollar in home equity and a dollar in an investment portfolio are simply not equivalent when the specific goal is retiring early, even though both dollars show up identically on a basic net worth calculation. Let me walk you through the specific ways this shows up. Number 1, the down payment as unrealized investment growth. A $45,000 down payment, instead of sitting in home equity invested in a diversified portfolio at a historical average return, compounds meaningfully over 15 to 20 years. That specific $45,000 left to grow in the market rather than converted into home equity can realistically become $150,000 to $250,000 or more over a 15 to 20 year early retirement timeline, growth that a down payment doesn't generate in the same liquid compounding way, since home equity growth is tied to regional real estate appreciation rather than diversified market returns, and can't be reinvested or compounded the same way a growing portfolio balance can. Number 2, Mortgage principal payments as a forced, illiquid savings account. Every mortgage payment splits between interest and principal, and the principal portion is, in a sense, forced savings, building equity. But it's savings locked inside an illiquid asset, unlike a retirement account contribution, which remains flexible, sellable, and directly usable to fund monthly expenses the moment early retirement actually begins. A homeowner 15 years into a mortgage has built substantial equity through this forced savings mechanism, but that equity can't simply be spent down gradually the way an investment portfolio can, month by month, to cover living expenses in retirement. Number 3. Property taxes as a permanent, rising expense with no early retirement offset. Property taxes typically rise over time, sometimes significantly, and unlike a mortgage payment, which eventually ends once the loan is paid off, property taxes continue indefinitely for as long as the home is owned. Someone planning an early retirement budget needs to account for this as a permanent line item that never disappears, unlike a mortgage, and one that specifically continues to draw down whatever liquid assets they do have, since property taxes must be paid in cash, not in home equity. Number 4. Home maintenance and repair costs that scale unpredictably. Industry estimates commonly suggest budgeting 1 to 4% of a home's value annually for maintenance and repairs, a wide and unpredictable range that includes routine upkeep alongside major unplanned expenses, a roof replacement, a failed HVAC system, foundation issues. A retiree living on a fixed, carefully calculated budget is far more exposed to a single unexpected $15,000 repair than a renter, whose maintenance costs are entirely the landlord's responsibility and who can factor a predictable rent payment into their retirement budget without this specific category of unpredictable risk. Number 5. Homeowners' insurance costs that have risen faster than general inflation in many markets. In regions increasingly exposed to climate-related risk, wildfire, flooding, severe storms, homeowners' insurance premiums have in many markets risen substantially faster than general inflation over recent years, sometimes forcing homeowners into difficult choices between reduced coverage, higher deductibles, or premiums that consume a meaningfully larger share of a fixed retirement budget than originally planned when the home was purchased. Number 6. The geographic anchor effect that eliminates cost of living arbitrage. One of the most powerful, underused tools for early retirement is relocating to a lower cost of living area once no longer tied to a specific job location, a strategy that can dramatically stretch a retirement portfolio. A homeowner, particularly one with a low fixed mortgage rate secured during a period of lower rates, faces a real disincentive to relocate, since selling means giving up that rate and incurring transaction costs, while a renter can relocate at the end of any lease term with minimal friction, capturing cost of living arbitrage that a homeowner effectively forfeits by staying anchored to their specific property. Number 7. Transaction costs that silently erode the homeownership builds wealth narrative. Buying and selling a home typically involves transaction costs, real estate agent commissions, closing costs, moving expenses that can easily total 8 to 10% of the home's value across a single buy and sell cycle. Someone who buys then needs to sell within a shorter time frame than originally planned due to a job change, a health issue, or simply revised retirement plans can find these transaction costs meaningfully eating into what looked like straightforward home appreciation on paper. Number 8. The opportunity cost of a large emergency fund tied up in a down payment mentality. Many prospective homebuyers save aggressively for years, specifically toward a down payment, treating that saved capital as fundamentally different from retirement savings, a house fund mental account that often sits in cash or low-yield savings rather than invested, both because it's earmarked for a near-term purchase and because home buying timelines feel less flexible than a multi-decade retirement timeline, meaning years of savings sit outside the market entirely, missing growth that could have compounded significantly by the time early retirement actually arrives. Number 9. The psychological anchor of, the mortgage must be paid off before I can retire. Many early retirement planners, even sophisticated ones, mentally treat an outstanding mortgage balance as something that must be eliminated before retirement can begin, even when the math might favor carrying a low, fixed-rate mortgage into retirement and letting a larger invested portfolio continue generating returns instead. This psychological anchor, not paying off debt, delays actual retirement dates by years in some cases, driven more by a feeling of security than by the underlying math of the specific interest rate involved versus expected investment returns. Number 10. Home equity that doesn't generate cash flow without additional action. A retiree with $400,000 in home equity and $400,000 in a brokerage account are not in equivalent positions. The brokerage account can be drawn down gradually, systematically, to fund monthly expenses. The The home equity requires an additional, often complicated step, a home equity line of credit, a reverse mortgage, an actual sale and relocation, each with its own costs, risks, and complications, before it can fund a single month of retirement living expenses. Number 11, the sunk cost trap of a home that no longer fits the retirement plan. Someone who buys a larger family home in their 30s or 40s, appropriate for raising children, often finds that same home no longer fits their needs once early retirement actually approaches. Too large, too expensive to maintain, in the wrong location for a downsized retirement lifestyle. But having spent years, sometimes decades, building emotional and financial attachment to that specific home, they frequently delay the downsizing decision that would actually free up capital for retirement, treating the home as a fixed point rather than a flexible asset that should evolve with their changing goals. Number 12. HOA fees and special assessments as an underestimated recurring cost. Homes in planned communities or condominiums often carry HOA fees that rise over time, plus the risk of special assessments for major building repairs or improvements, unpredictable, sometimes substantial one-time costs that a renter never faces and that a retiree on a fixed income budget can find genuinely destabilizing when they arrive unexpectedly. Number 13, the illiquidity trap during a market downturn near retirement. Someone planning to sell a home to help fund early retirement, perhaps downsizing at the point of retirement, faces real risk if a housing market downturn coincides with their planned retirement date, forcing a choice between selling into a weak market or delaying retirement, a risk that simply doesn't exist in the same way for a diversified liquid portfolio, which can be drawn down flexibly according to a sustainable withdrawal strategy, regardless of any single asset's short-term price movement. Number 14, the forced overspending that comes with more square footage than needed. Home ownership, particularly of a larger home purchased with future family growth in mind, frequently comes with more space than a household actually uses, space that still requires heating, cooling, cleaning, furnishing, and maintaining, a recurring cost premium attached to square footage that provides no meaningful benefit toward the specific goal of early retirement, unlike a right-sized rental chosen deliberately for current, not anticipated future, needs. Number 15, the misconception that mortgage interest deductions meaningfully offset these costs. Many homeowners overestimate how much their mortgage interest tax deduction actually reduces their effective housing cost, particularly since standard deduction increases in recent years have reduced the number of taxpayers who benefit from itemizing at all, meaning the psychological comfort of, at least it's tax deductible, frequently doesn't translate into the meaningful financial offset many homeowners assume it does. Number 16. The comparison trap against a hypothetical wasted rent payment. The common argument that renting is throwing money away implicitly assumes that home ownership costs are entirely wealth building, ignoring that mortgage interest, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance are also money that doesn't build equity, often totaling a substantial share of a total monthly housing payment, meaning the true wealth-building versus wasted comparison between renting and owning is considerably closer than the popular framing suggests, once every cost category on both sides is fully accounted for. Number 17. Reduced flexibility to weather a career gap or income disruption. A renter facing a job loss or reduced income can, in the worst case, downsize to a cheaper rental relatively quickly. A homeowner facing the same disruption faces a much more complicated, slower, and costlier process to reduce their housing costs, since selling a home takes months, involves transaction costs, and can't be executed on short notice the way ending a lease and finding a cheaper rental can. A flexibility gap that matters enormously for anyone pursuing an aggressive, higher-risk early retirement timeline where income disruptions are more consequential. Number 18. The underappreciated cost of capital tied up rather than compounding early. Because of how compound growth works, capital invested in your 20s and early 30s has dramatically more time to grow than the same capital invested a decade later. Every dollar redirected toward a down payment and ongoing home equity building, rather than invested in a retirement account during these specific early years, loses not just that dollar's growth, but years of compounding on that growth, a cost that's structurally front-loaded and therefore disproportionately larger for younger buyers than the same decision would cost someone buying later in their career. Number 19. Underestimating how much lifestyle house creep happens alongside lifestyle spending creep. Just as income rises tend to pull spending upward, rising income and home equity often pull home ownership decisions upward too, upgrading to a larger or nicer home specifically because it now feels affordable. A decision that resets the entire down payment and mortgage cycle at a larger scale and further delays the point at which housing costs stop competing directly with retirement contributions for the same monthly cash flow. Number 20, the absence of any explicit comparison between the two paths in most people's actual decision-making process. The most important mechanism on this entire list is simply that almost nobody buying a home, especially one specifically pursuing early retirement, runs the actual side-by-side math. What would this exact down payment and every dollar of the ongoing cost difference between buying and renting actually become if invested instead over the specific years until my planned retirement date? Without running that comparison explicitly, homeownership simply happens, treated as an assumed milestone rather than an actively evaluated financial decision measured against a specific quantified alternative. Now let's take apart the myths that keep this blind spot firmly in place. Myth 1. Renting is throwing money away, while a mortgage payment builds wealth. Both renting and owning involve costs that don't build equity, mortgage interest, property tax, insurance, maintenance on the owning side, the entire rent payment on the renting side. The real comparison isn't wasted money versus wealth-building money. It's the total cost of each path compared against what the difference, invested, could become. Myth 2. A home is always a great investment. Housing markets vary enormously by region and time period, and while real estate has appreciated meaningfully in many markets over long periods, that appreciation has to be weighed against transaction costs, ongoing carrying costs, and the opportunity cost of the capital tied up in it, a comparison that doesn't always favor home ownership, especially for someone whose specific goal is maximizing liquid, retirement fundable assets by a particular target date. Myth 3. Paying off my mortgage should be a top financial priority before I retire. Whether prepaying a mortgage or investing that same money makes more sense depends specifically on the mortgage's interest rate compared to realistic expected investment returns, not on a generalized cultural belief that debt-free is automatically better, particularly for a low, fixed-rate mortgage that inflation is quietly making cheaper in real terms every year. It remains outstanding. Myth 4. I need to own a home to have housing security in retirement. Long-term rental stability is achievable in many markets, and the flexibility a renter retains to downsize, relocate, or adjust housing costs in response to changing circumstances can represent its own form of security, arguably more relevant to an early retirement plan than the specific type of security home ownership provides. Myth 5. Once I've been renting too long, buying finally makes sense just to stop the cycle. The right comparison at any point in time is still the actual math of the specific opportunity in front of you, not a psychological sense that enough years of renting have accumulated to justify a purchase regardless of the underlying numbers for your specific goal and timeline. Daniela and her husband, both 33, ran this exact comparison for the first time after 5 years of vaguely planning to buy eventually, calculating what their planned $60,000 down payment plus the ongoing monthly cost difference between their target home and their current rental would become if invested instead over their planned 15-year path to early retirement. They found the invested alternative would put them roughly 4 years ahead of their current retirement timeline, a gap large enough that they decided to continue renting deliberately, not out of indecision, but as an active, calculated strategy aligned with their specific goal. Robert bought a home at 35, prioritizing space for his growing family, a decision he still considers correct for that specific season of life. But running the same retirement timeline math at 44, he realized his home equity, while substantial on paper, represented years of delay to his original early retirement target compared to what that same capital would have become invested, prompting him to plan a deliberate downsizing sale at 50, specifically to convert a portion of that illiquid equity back into the liquid, retirement fundable assets his actual goal requires. So here's the actual framework for deciding whether homeownership supports or sabotages your specific early retirement goal. If your primary goal is maximizing liquid assets by a specific early retirement date, run the explicit math before buying. Calculate what your down payment and the ongoing monthly cost difference between owning and renting an equivalent property would become if invested instead, using a realistic expected return over the specific number of years until your target retirement date. If that invested alternative would meaningfully outpace your projected home equity plus any appreciation, factor that gap directly into your decision rather than defaulting to homeownership as an assumed milestone. If you do choose to buy, treat the decision as an active one relative to your specific goal, not a passive cultural default. Buy the smallest home that genuinely meets your needs rather than the largest one that feels affordable. Avoid rate and term decisions that eliminate your future geographic flexibility if relocation is part of your retirement strategy. and build an explicit plan for how you'll convert home equity into liquid, spendable assets at the point you actually intend to retire, whether that's a planned downsizing sale, a reverse mortgage, or another specific mechanism, rather than assuming the equity will simply be there and available when needed. If you're already a homeowner and pursuing early retirement, run the numbers on your specific mortgage rate against realistic expected investment returns before assuming aggressive prepayment is the right move, and build an explicit downsizing or equity conversion plan into your retirement timeline, rather than treating your current home as a fixed, permanent element of your retirement picture. Daniela and her husband continue renting deliberately, redirecting what would have been a down payment directly into their investment accounts, tracking their progress against their specific early retirement date, rather than against a cultural sense of when they should own a home. Robert is now actively planning his downsizing sale, treating his home not as a permanent fixture, but as one flexible asset among several that needs to actively serve his retirement goal rather than simply exist alongside it. Go back to those two coworkers. Same starting salary, same age, same commitment to early retirement. One built substantial equity in an asset that, at 46, represents genuine wealth on paper, but limited immediate flexibility toward the specific goal of stopping work. The other built a liquid portfolio that, at the same age, represents genuine, immediately actionable freedom. Neither decision was wrong in some absolute sense, but only one of them was made by explicitly measuring the actual trade-off against a specific, quantified goal, rather than assuming that building equity and building early retirement readiness were automatically the same thing.